Okay, well, good evening, everyone. It's great to be here and great to see so many people here. I'm Peter Betts. I was for many years a civil servant, working for the last 10 years, Director International Climate and Energy in Department of Business and Energy, and I'm now an Associate Fellow, among other things, at Chatham House. We've got a great panel, and they're going to speak in sort of order as they go away from me. So first up will be Doug McMartin, who's a Senior Research Associate at Cornell University and a Research Professor for Computing and Mathematical Sciences at Caltech. Then we've got Anna Maria Kleinmeier, who's Strategic Legal Counsel at the Institute for Governance and Sustainable Development Goals. And finally, we've got Janos Pastor, who I'm sure many of you will be familiar to many of you, has had a long and distinguished career at the UN and elsewhere, and he's now the Executive Director at the Carnegie Climate Geoengineering Governance Initiative. So this event tonight is being hosted in partnership with the Carnegie Climate Geoengineering Governance Initiative. The event is on the record and is being live streamed. The event will be followed by a reception. So at the end of this, we all troop upstairs for a drink. I gather I'm familiar with all this new technology, but people can comment via Twitter using, I think that's a hashtag, CHEvents. Please, I'm asked to, could everyone please put their phones on silent mode, including me. And please note that Chatham House staff will be in the room, normally standing at the back or on the sides, in order to assist in the event of an emergency or technical difficulty. So I think that's all I've been told I have to say before we start. So I guess without further ado, we'll go to the speakers, and I think first, Doug, you're going to talk us through a little bit some of the science and the engineering around solar engineering.
Thank you. So I'm going to do an impossible task of trying to introduce geoengineering a little bit and put it in context in about 6 or 7 minutes. So this is basically approaches that would cool the planet directly by reflecting some sunlight back to space. And if you get absolutely nothing else, the most important single message is that this is not a replacement for cutting carbon emissions. We still have to reduce our carbon emissions to zero. The challenge is that it's no longer possible. It's certainly no longer very likely that we are going to be able to avoid significant climate impacts purely by reducing our emissions. So just for context, the Paris Agreement set an aspirational goal of 1.5 degree warming, and the commitments to mitigation made in that agreement put us more on track for about 3 degrees of warming. The other thing, just in terms of broad context, is because CO2 has a long lifetime in the atmosphere, getting our emissions to zero doesn't stop climate change. That simply stops it from getting worse. So there's 2 additional tools that at least need to be part of the conversation. One is that there's a number of approaches that could pull CO2 directly out of the atmosphere. That's not the focus tonight, but there's a number of such ideas. The challenge with those is that we don't yet have any approach that is sufficiently scalable to matter and not extraordinarily expensive, and without any local impacts. We've got any 2 of those 3, but not all 3. So that leaves us in a situation where we at least need to acknowledge the possibility that we could be facing significant and prolonged overshoot of our temperature targets. And that's where there's at least a plausible role for talking about the solar geoengineering. So there's 2 broad ideas that are encompassed in that. The one that we understand the best is if you put aerosols into the stratosphere, so small reflective droplets or particles, much, much higher than commercial aircraft fly. The atmosphere is relatively stable, and so up there, and so if you put material there, it stays there for a period of time and reflects sunlight. We know with certainty that that would cool the planet, both from basic physics, less energy coming in, and because the motivation for that comes from mimicking what happens after a large volcanic eruption. So the last big eruption was Mount Pinatubo in 1991, put about 30 megatons of sulfate in the stratosphere and cooled the planet the following year by something of order half a degree Celsius or a little less. So the idea there would be to do that deliberately, probably with aircraft. No aircraft exists today that could do that, but it doesn't look like it is fundamentally difficult if somebody wanted to design and develop that. The other approach that's sort of on the table is marine cloud brightening, basically spray salt water into boundary layer clouds off the ocean. Under the right conditions, that's likely to make the clouds brighter and more reflective. That's unfortunately also the most uncertain part of climate science, and so we're less confident in whether or not that actually works in a meaningful sense or not. Just want to make sure I say all the things that need to be said. You know, the 10,000-foot view, we do not today have enough research on either of these ideas to know with certainty whether or not it would reduce climate risk. We know we would be able to reduce the global temperature, but it does not affect the climate the same way as reducing CO2 emissions. And so it is at least plausible that it would reduce climate risks for most people, but there are some physical climate challenges, so it might affect precipitation patterns differently. If you use stratospheric aerosols, it affects ozone concentrations, for example. And the biggest challenges, in some sense, really come from the governance side of things. So if you were to do this, it affects everybody on the planet. How do you decide? How confident do you need to be? How do you make sure this isn't taken as an excuse not to mitigate? If you don't mitigate and try to use this, you're basically left with more and more and more forcing that you then have to sustain practically forever. Final comments that I want to make is we need to be thinking about governance for deployment. We also need to be thinking about governance for the research process. So right now, everything we know comes from running climate models. Those are calibrated to some extent on things like observations after Pinatubo. But if we want to be in a position where we can support an informed decision, we are eventually going to need to do some outdoor experimentation. That does not mean, you know, large-scale stuff that would actually affect the climate. As an example, Harvard has proposed this experiment where they would launch a balloon into the stratosphere and release, I think it's tens of kilograms of material. And the purpose of that would be to validate some of the chemical reaction processes. And then there's a similar experiment that's proposed for marine cloud brightening. So I will wrap up my allotted time there. Just to bring us and save more time for questions, because I sort of give you the thumbnail sketch of everything. Just to bring it back to why we're talking about this in the first place. You would not take chemotherapy drugs just for fun. You would not sit in your car and set off your airbags just for fun. There are clearly serious challenges with solar geoengineering, but they only make sense to face in context with the challenges from climate change itself.
That was terrific, Doug, and also very, very clear and to time. So good job on a very complex subject. So
yeah, I probably missed about so just ask questions afterwards.
Yeah, well, we're gonna. I mean, your concision means we're going to have time for questions, which is great. So Anna.
Great, thank you. Thanks, and thanks, Doug, for taking the hard part of the of the panel. Just a small point of clarification. I do work for the institute mentioned, and I also work directly as an advisor for a number of developing countries, and I do a lot of capacity building work for United Nations Environment. And so I work pretty much in every region of the world with developing countries directly, doing training on lots of aspects of climate change. So, so that's, I think, part of why I was invited to be here today, because of the work that I've been doing with developing countries for about 15 years. So I've been asked to address some of the risks and potential benefits and to look at the relationship between this potential technology, the use of geoengineering, and the the imperative of moving towards sustainable development goals by developing countries, by all countries. And so I'm going to do my best in a few minutes of time. So a few years ago, I think 2016, the average atmospheric concentrations of CO2 reached 400 parts per million, which for those of you who follow climate change was already beyond where the limits that we were hoping to set as a global community. That level last occurred, I think, 3 million years ago, when temperatures were at 2 to 3 degrees above warmer where we are now, and sea levels were 10 to 20 meters above what they currently are today. That unfortunate news was followed just last year by the IPCC special report on 1.5 degrees that I think everybody is now familiar with because it's made quite an impact. And the IPCC announced that the world, although, in order to keep warming below 1.5 degrees without an overshoot, that in order to do that, it's practically impossible to do so without some interventions with the atmosphere, particularly carbon removal technologies. That this is part of why we're here talking about geoengineering today, because of that very strong and clear message that the IPCC has sent us. Moreover, climate change science tells us that even if we were to dramatically drop CO2 levels by decarbonizing, and I think Doug referred to this, that the world continues to warm, that doesn't solve the problem, that we still have the impacts of the onset of climate change and the impacts that are related to those. For developing countries, and especially the most vulnerable developing countries and communities, the impacts of climate change are likely to be catastrophic. And when I say likely, I was just in Tuvalu 10 days ago, and it's beyond likely. I mean, they are feeling the impacts of climate change. The sea level rose during the king tides 2 days before I arrived, and the water was bubbling up through the streets and the airport because the ground is so porous and the sea level is already rising enough to have that kind of an impact today. For developing countries, the impact on their sustainable development goals is likely to be enormous. Poverty, hunger, health and well-being, access to clean water and sanitation, peace, all these sustainable development goals that countries are striving to achieve and putting all of their resources and energy into. One can make an argument, in fact, that nearly all of the goals will be negatively impacted by the advance of climate change. And as we know, some of the impacts and effects, such as water table contamination from seawater, are irreversible. And that's the case in Tuvalu. They have no groundwater. They depend entirely on rainwater for their survival. Much of my work focuses on capacity building, as I mentioned, and one of the biggest difficulties for developing countries when they're working on projects for adaptation, and even some for mitigation, but particularly for adaptation to reduce vulnerability and to strengthen their resilience to climate change, is distinguishing between a development project and an adaptation project. In fact, most of those projects look exactly alike, and to them, to those countries who have been working on their development goals for decades, they struggle to prove that it's an adaptation project and not simply an irrigation project for agriculture or a water storage project for access to drinking water, for example. And climate change is moving faster than their capacity to develop. And so resilience and development, strengthening their systems to adapt to climate change is seeming more and more difficult, if not in some cases impossible. So I mention that to say that time is not on our side. Realistically speaking, I think we're all aware that the current financing for climate change, both mitigation and adaptation actions, is insufficient to meet the global needs, and the United Nations Environment puts out a number of important reports. The gap reports are really important to see the gap between what we're able to finance and what we actually need to do in order to protect countries and to enable them to continue on their sustainable development path. And so personally, when I first heard about the issue of geoengineering and solar radiation management, I was terrified by the prospect of it. It seemed like a futuristic technology that we know very little about what the impacts will be. We don't know exactly whether it's possible, how it's possible, and it just seems and continues to seem to me personally, as someone who works on the climate change adaptation side, it seems particularly frightening what the prospects will be, and so do the prospects of the impacts of climate change. So for developing countries, and especially these most vulnerable ones, we're looking at rock in a hard place kind of scenario, and yet we can't slow down or not find solutions, because for many of these countries, we're talking about life or death scenarios for many people. So I thought I would kind of highlight what I and some of my colleagues who work on climate change see as some of the risks, and Doug pointed to some of those, but I thought I would maybe underline a few of those and then talk a little bit about some of the potential benefits that we're weighing as we look at what is not so distant a future. There are the risks seem significant, and there's this moral hazard risk. The possibility that having a silver bullet or a magic pill could lead certain players, global players, and to feel that they don't have the responsibility, that there's something that can fix the problem, and that they can therefore continue with business as usual in terms of the climate emissions, because we'll just SRM our way out of it. There's also the instant gratification risk, where the temptation to reach for fast results will make SRM seem like a quick fix that governments or that others prioritize in terms of resources, in terms of attention, in terms of financing. They prioritize that instead of greenhouse gas reductions, or instead of looking further into advancing the carbon dioxide removal technologies. Then there's the risk that dramatically and rapidly altering the atmosphere to drop temperatures could lead to some unexpected atmospheric or hydrological consequences that we're simply unaware of, because we have not done it at that scale, or in some cases not done it at all. So these are all great unknowns and seem like great risks from the perspective of countries who in particular are vulnerable to anything that happens in their natural environment and the atmosphere around them, where they don't have the resilience, the infrastructure to survive dramatic changes to their atmosphere.
Marie, you're coming to a close soon.
Yes, sure, thanks. So then, there's after seeing the risk perspective, then there's the potential benefit of buying time, and this is where I see that there's a great need for additional research, a great need for additional information and understanding, and to amplify or expand the options that are available. And that's where the governance piece comes in, because that research, if it happens haphazard, if there's not financing available for it, and if there's not coordination around it, then it's unlikely to happen, and then you have additional other risks that arise. So, these, I think I can close there and leave for additional questions as we think about those connections.
Great, thank you very much, Anna Maria. Very, very sobering. Thanks very much. Let's go to Janos, and then we can take time for some questions.
Thank you, Pete, and good evening. And it's nice to see some old friends and some hopefully new friends here. Thank you for coming. And maybe I just want to put 2 points down before I get into what I wanted to talk about, which is to share with you a few thoughts about the governance issues. And the first is that from our perspective at the Carnegie Initiative, we are not promoting geoengineering. We're not against these technologies intrinsically either. We're trying to be impartial about the need for them. So that's not our purpose. Our purpose is to look at the governance. If societies were to decide to go in that direction, then to make sure that they are well governed. And the second point is that governance, in our perspective, is really a broad concept which talks about decisions, about some technology or some method, but it's also about managing, regulating, and ensuring effective participation of different stakeholders with access to appropriate information so that they can actually participate. So governance is not just regulation, but it's this broader set of issues. Now, my colleagues have made a very important case, and I don't need to get into that anymore, of why we're in deep trouble when it comes to climate change, and why there are increasingly discussions, if this is what it is, that the emissions are not coming down the way they should be coming down. The IPCC special report is making the case of the challenging situation that we're in. What's the plan? And when there is such a situation, then more and more people begin to talk about these not alternatives, but potential additional technologies. And as Doug, you said it very clearly, the governance challenges are quite important. And in fact, many people believe that the governance of these technologies will be much more difficult to address than the actual scientific technical developments themselves. So because it is difficult, because it might take a long time, it's not too early to start talking about them. Now, when we look outside in the world, what we see is actually very little happening in this area. We have relatively little research going on. There is some. There's some people planning physical experiments, but in fact, there's not a lot going on. And when you look at governments, and this is one of the jobs that we're doing, we've been engaging with a lot of government representatives and to see what they're doing in this area, and the answer is practically nothing. Very little is happening. There has been not much discussion, and the policy space is basically not ready to engage in this kind of discussion. Yet, it may be necessary, not necessarily to deploy, but at least may be necessary to see how one addresses these technologies. Now, what are some of the key challenges? As mentioned already, research is already happening, and it needs itself to be governed, not just to be regulated, and that's part of it, but it's also to provide guidance to the research community of what the society would like to see in terms of research results. And there are people who worry about research because they think that research today will do some more research tomorrow, and then it's a slippery slope to suddenly deployment. And these are issues that one needs to address. But the most difficult issues arise when, for solar radiation modification, when we think about decisions. Decisions to even consider this technology. Who should make that decision? Where and when? In what context? Is in the United Nations, in the OECD, individual in a country? How should these decisions be taken, even to consider, and then at some point to deploy or not? And at the moment, we can raise the questions, but governments have not started even thinking about how to do it. And the important question is when to start thinking about it. Do we wait until it's 4 degrees above historical average, or do we think about it now, knowing that it might take 15, 20, 25 years to figure all this out and make it happen if we think we need to do it? So decisions of is crucial. But then even if we were to be able to make those decisions, how to implement it, how to set up an institutional structure that would allow continuous action on solar radiation modification for decades, possibly generations to come, in a smooth way without stopping abruptly, because you cannot do that, irrespective of political, economic processes that are happening in the world, to make sure that we don't end up in the so-called termination effect. And then who controls the global thermostat? Who should say that we should go for 1 degree or 2? Knowing that there are different impacts in different parts of the world. And indeed, local, regional, global impacts will have to be addressed in local, regional, and global governance mechanisms. And they will not all be the same. And there will also be the impacts on generations not yet born. So we have to think of interregional and intergenerational aspects. And then there are the more fundamental religious and almost philosophical questions, which are of concern to many people. How can we, humanity, think we can play God and manipulate nature, manipulate the one atmosphere we have? Some people think we can do that, and we should be able to do that. We have the technology, let's do it. Others have deep worries about that. All that requires a societal discussion and debate that hasn't happened, and we believe it needs to happen. Now, a few words about in a sort of a perfect world, science-based, we can think of a nice rational process where we get the science, we understand what's happening, and then there will outcome a nice multilateral process and a decision of how to deal with this technology. Now, we don't live in a perfect world, and it may happen that way. We don't know that. We need to think about it. We need to try to plan for that. But in reality, it may happen very differently, and we need to be ready for that too, and how to govern that. What if a country unilaterally decides to do ungoverned solar radiation modification? What if a rich individual, because let's face it, it's quite cheap, the direct cost. A rich individual could just do that and decides, I'm going to save the world. Or what if a few countries who are sick and tired of insufficient action by the world community to reduce emissions, they decide to do this? These are different scenarios that one needs to be ready for, and one needs to engage, because some of these could have very substantial geopolitical considerations and impacts. Some positive, some negative, and we need to be ready to do that. And that's not where it stops. Just last week there was an interesting article about the global citizenship, using social media, taking action, and thousands of individuals sending up balloons in different parts of the world and releasing aerosols, and thereby fixing the problem. Now, imagine the governance challenges of that. Now, how plausible that is, I don't know today, but the fact of the matter is that we need to at least consider that. And then I'll stop here with just saying that our initiative, what we try to do is we try to encourage this debate. We try to shift the debate from just purely the scientific academic circles into the policy space, so that governments can start to understand, and the civil society and the private sector can engage in this discussion. And we're doing that, and hopefully we'll be able to catalyze and support a global learning process and capacity building process to understand better these issues so that we can deal with them when the time comes. Thank you.
Great, thanks very much, Janusz. So my notes tell me that I'm actually encouraged to usurp the role of chairman by asking the first question. So, three very powerful presentations. Clearly, you're right that we are not on track for 2 degrees or 1.5 degrees. Clearly, you're right that the implications of a 3-degree world are really damaging. And yet, you're also right that there is, very little debate in the sort of climate community about solar engineering in particular. And if it's raised, then I think fears people have. Well, firstly, as you alluded to this. Well, if we talk too much about this, we will discourage the action we desperately need on emission reductions. People also worry some of these technologies could have very negative side effects, as you again alluded to. And I think insofar as the debate, thirdly, I think insofar as the debate has started, that people are recognizing that trajectories for 2 degrees or 1.5 degrees need significant zero emissions, negative emissions rather. people are more focused on direct air capture, this increasing sense, oh, well, we're going to have limitless amounts of almost free renewable energy. We can do this. We don't need these exotic solar engineering type solutions. So, I mean, those are three pretty serious challenges. I mean, what would be your kind of 1 minute response on them?
I guess I'm not going to address all of that, but my my reaction right now is that we do not currently have a guaranteed clear pathway to a risk-free future, and that it would be premature, this is my personal view, premature to exclude options. Direct air capture, we don't actually know how much that's going to cost. We actually don't know how hard it's going to be to store tens of gigatons of CO2 per year. The decision, there's something else I was going to add, but I forgot what it was, so I'll stop there.
That's great. That's great. If he comes back to you, interrupt. Any?
Well, I would say that if there is we're in a challenging situation, that's fairly clear, and as you said, we don't have a clarity of the risk-free or wonderful options that can bring us to the objective. So in that situation, we probably need more options than less options, and if there is a chance that we might need this option, however terrifying it may look, let's at least understand it so that we can take decisions. Because the reality is that we are facing a huge challenge of risk management between different options. And let's face it, none of them are just good options. They are all difficult options. They all have risks. They may have some benefits, some potential benefits, and the challenge is how we address it together. But risk is looked at very differently by different people in society, different sectors, different stakeholders, and people in different parts of the world. So we must engage them in that discussion of risk.
Perhaps I'll just add to that. I mean, as an international lawyer and having worked on a number of the environmental treaties, that international governance of environmental issues, it provides not only an opportunity to better understand risks through research, information, exchange of ideas and perspectives, but it also gives the opportunity to develop mechanisms for further exploring new options. And so it's not only about let's make some rules and control a certain situation or control an outcome, but a lot of what the international treaties provide us with is information and opportunity for exchange. And for small developing countries, it provides them an opportunity to have a voice.
Fair enough. I mean, these are difficult questions, and we should have in the audience. I mean, I suppose the only other observation I would make, and before sort of throwing it up, and you may have reactions to this, is, some of us have worked many years in the multilateral negotiations. We know how difficult it is. We know that, in the end, there's an incentive on countries to engage in a multilateral process because, no country can tackle the emissions challenge on their own. They need to persuade the others to come to the table and reduce their emissions. Whereas you don't have that dynamic in geoengineering. Actually, an individual country could say, well, I'm just going to do this and I'm saving the world. And, there's nothing to force that country, as it were, to the table if they really don't want to come. So that's a challenge. Yeah.
Yeah.
Look, let's throw it open. Maybe I'll take the lady in the second. I have to take question one at a time rather than gather them in three. So I'll take the lady there. Yes, great.
But maybe there was another one. Thank you for that. That was really very interesting, and I hope that my question isn't stating the obvious since we're talking about governance here. So forgive me if this is a naive question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. So we talked about the unintended consequences from an environmental standpoint, obviously, but I was wondering from a security standpoint how much people are talking about that. I've heard kind of bits and pieces about security. So if someone decides they want to do something hazardous to another country, not a save the world type, but well, this country's pissing me off, so forgive my American, but is there a discussion on the table about that right now as well, or are we focusing, more on the environmental side?
So I'll do a first response in terms of the physics. With stratospheric aerosols, it's pretty hard to mess somebody else's climate without messing your own. It's effectively a global solution, so you're just going to cool the entire globe. And there's sort of pretty limited opportunities for...
But cooling might be good for you and bad for your neighbor.
In principle. Marine, I could certainly hypothesize paths that there may be some way in the future to do things with marine cloud brightening. Maybe if I cool here, it'll steer rain somewhere else. But that's not something that... I think nobody in the community even wants to actually research those questions. And it's sort of beyond our current understanding right now.
Did you want
to add to?
Yeah, so you asked, are there people thinking about this? Yes, there are some people. One of them is in the back room here. So there have been papers written on this, but if you're asking, have governments started thinking about the geopolitical security implications of this? Not really. There have been discussions, for example, in the Security Council about the implications of climate change on security, but not specifically of solar geoengineering. Yet, there could be some very substantial implications. Again, not necessarily all negative, so it's just, one has to understand that there are different issues here, but they need to be discussed at some point. For example, the potential for unilateral action and what the international community does to either prevent it or to deal with it if it does happen.
Great. I've been told to take questions one at a time, but I think I'll take three just so that as many people... So I've got gentleman there, and gentleman there.
Hello, my name's Hugh Hunt from Cambridge University. I've got a question about intellectual property. I worked on the SPICE project in 2011, and our experiment, the governance process applied back then, meant that our experiment was cancelled. And one of the key issues then was some patent applications that were in at the time. We worked out that the experiments, the outdoor experiments we were thinking of, were going to cost perhaps $500 million to do over a period of a few years, and no government research organisation was likely to fund that. So we would almost certainly have to go to private enterprise to fund this research. And you can't really get private enterprise to come on board without some intellectual property. So what's your opinion about intellectual property as applied to geoengineering research?
Okay, and then gentleman here.
Sam Gill, Associate Fellow at Chatham House.
Are you from any other organisation?
And China Dialogue. It's a question, I think, for Professor McMartin as the sort of scientist on here, in that there's quite a lot of discussion about risk, but it often comes back to sort of moral hazard and the difficulties of governing a process that would come out of a possible event where geoengineering happened. I guess I was more interested in whether you could flesh out what plausible mechanisms there are for the environment, for the purported environmental risks of employing SRM. Even if I understand that it's very problematic to put probabilities on this, but just what's plausible in terms of actually outcomes that could be that could spiral out of control.
Great. And then finally, gentleman there.
Nizar Al-Baharna from Community Development Enterprise. I think talking about the governance is very important, but the most important thing is the framework for that governance. Because usually developing countries suffer more than developed countries. And if the framework just focus on who can do and who are able, then what will happen that who will suffer is the developing countries. So it's just like if it goes just to like the Security Council or something like that, it will be only for the elite who are capable. These countries are, some countries are capable of research And those who are not capable, of course, they cannot do anything. But at the end, everybody will be affected. So I think the framework should include the sort of the developing and developed countries fairly. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. I guess there's questions that sort of gravitate more towards you, but then there's questions more at the other end, and to Anna-Maria. Do you want to go first, Doug?
So with regards to the physical environmental risks, there's a number. With stratospheric aerosols or marine cloud brightening, it's not going to affect the climate the same way, so it will shift precipitation patterns to some extent. Climate change also shifts precipitation patterns, right? So there's some relative risks there. And precipitation is actually very difficult to predict with the climate models. So it's a little bit hard to say precisely what those impacts are likely to be. Climate models will say, if you were, say, to go from 3 degrees down to 1.5 degrees with solar geoengineering, you'll effectively overcompensate the precipitation a little bit. So it'll be a little drier than a 1.5 degree world without that, but difficult to make explicit bounds on specific things. To a certain extent, at least, we have a constraint on the potential for unknown unknowns in that we have volcanic eruptions. So this is, it's hard to imagine a scenario that would be totally catastrophic that we wouldn't have seen from eruptions. But there are some big unknowns, like you change the ratio of direct to diffuse light, which could have some impact on ecosystem competition, or even agricultural productivity. There's the effect on ozone that I mentioned. Marine cloud brightening, the one thing with that is because you're doing a lot of, it only works on certain parts of the ocean, so you're doing a lot of forcing on small part of the ocean, so you have a spatially heterogeneous forcing. It sounds more benign to put salt into clouds than sulfate into the stratosphere, but that forcing could lead to much more spatially heterogeneous response. So that would be my...
Great, thanks, Doug. Anna-Maria, I don't know if you want to comment maybe on the role of developing countries in the governance?
Yeah, just thank you for that comment and point. I think it's very important, not only in terms of looking at how a framework will function, how it will manage the risks to countries involved, how that framework also articulates with other frameworks or other treaties where developing countries and developed countries, or where there's difference in terms of contribution, participation, and impacts on those countries. And I just wanted to your point reminded me that there's a growing opinion, and I've read it in a recent article, that technology like SRM could in fact reduce risks of the impacts of climate change for developing countries, and that as such, as an opportunity to reduce risks, it's a benefit to developing countries and therefore should be prioritized and looked into. Then the questions that Janos brought up, so who does it and how is it done and who pays for it, who participates in the decision making? All those questions are unanswered.
Did you want to add to that?
2 points. One, first on Hugh's question about the intellectual property, not getting into the details of that, but there are different views on this, and many would say that the temperature of the globe and how to address it globally, perhaps through SRM, is such a global issue, and it is so much about a global good that it really has to be done through public channels and not private channels that would make intellectual property out of this. Now, that doesn't mean that private sector cannot be engaged and included in that, but it has to be in some kind of a publicly structured framework. Otherwise, you might end up in difficult situations. And then a brief comment on the gentleman about the north-south issues. It's absolutely essential. There is at least one group we work with, the so-called Solar Radiation Management Governance Initiative, SRMGI, whose specific objective is to engage developing country people in early discussions about the governance issues, so that it's not something that is developed, let's say, in the north, as it often happens, and then let's bring in the developing countries in the last minute, but rather do that from the beginning. So there are people who are trying to achieve that, and we also try to do that in our work. But in terms of structures and decision-making structures, it is fairly clear that if developing country participation works more effectively through multilateral UN-type intergovernmental institutions, because that's just the way, that's where they have a voice.
Right. So I've got a question at the back. Did I see you as well? No. And a question over there. So, gentlemen.
Hi, yeah, my name's Tom Wakeford from the ETC group. Just to put this in historical context, it seems we are embarking on something potentially on the scale of the Manhattan Project. I mean, this is a massive potential scale impact. Professor McMartin mentioned agricultural productivity. I mean, basically, my colleague from the community development side mentioned the impact on the global south and who's in control predominantly in the global north. It seems that SRM could potentially wipe out small-scale, smallholder agriculture across the global south. So going back to the analogy with the Manhattan Project, I mean, we now have various treaties, more or less strong, more or less under threat, but which effectively say, okay, there could be a crazy person setting off some sort of nuclear thing or building a nuclear project, but in general, you have controls on people developing nuclear weapons. So I think a ban is part of a governance spectrum, and one that, in the interests of actually having food to eat as the climate changes, we might want to consider.
Okay, thanks very much. Gentlemen, two along from you.
Hi, I'm Oliver Morton. I'm an editor at The Economist. I actually had a question for János, particularly. So the IMO has decided to reduce the sulfate aerosol burden over the world's open oceans, and thus make a distinct, though not in itself catastrophic, as it were, negative geoengineering that warms the world. In doing this, there's been no discussion of that climate impact of those changes, and there are very good reasons for making those changes. Do you consider an international organization legislating effectively to warm the world in this way a failure of governance?
And then final question for this round for the gentleman there.
I'm called Olaf Corrie. I'm from the University of Copenhagen. I guess my question is also mainly to János, but to everybody, I guess. And the sort of juxtaposition of greenhouse gas emissions reduction being a sort of free rider problem where we have to get everybody on board, versus solar geoengineering being a free driver problem where we have to make sure nobody rushes out ahead. I want to question how, although it's a kind of a neat way of thinking about it, but how much is the former actually a question of getting a few key actors to get their act together, and how much is the latter actually much more of a multilateral governance problem as well, in the sense that if governance means anything different from power, then it has to have some kind of accountability built into that concept. So in order to govern something on a global basis, that is an incredibly ambitious multilateral project. And as such, it has some of the similarities that traditional climate politics has, so to speak. What do you think?
I don't know who wants to go first.
So in response to Tom's question, actually my first comment is this would actually probably be a lot bigger than the Manhattan Project. This would be the biggest thing that humans have ever deliberately done on the planet. Just to be clear, or clarify my previous response on the agricultural response, pretty much every paper that's ever been written would suggest that if this is in addition to mitigation as opposed to a substitute, that would probably be a net benefit for agriculture because of the, particularly in the tropics, because of the limitation on heat stress in the tropics. I would caution that with the statement that right this instant, me personally, I would say I would not be prepared to go based on today's knowledge and say we should or we should not do this, although that's ultimately weighed in part in question of I don't think that the current impacts from climate change are sufficiently severe to warrant it. So if a paper came out tomorrow and said, we know with absolute certainty that if you don't do geoengineering now, we're going to get 4 meters of sea level rise, you know, I might change my risk calculus, but I don't think we're in a position where we should be forced to decide today, is this a good idea? I think we actually do need to conduct the research. But I actually don't understand why we would expect this to wipe out agriculture, smallholder agriculture in developing world. I would expect that if you had a prior, the sign of the effect would be the exact opposite of that.
Okay, great. Do you want to take those?
Okay. Well, Oliver's question. So it's not an easy one, but in some ways it is easy. I wouldn't say it's a failure of international governance. It's a failure of disjointed international governance. What we have is we have an international body looking at one set of issues and taking a decision without looking at the broader set of issues. And this is very often what we do in different disjointed international processes, that we solve a problem and we may either create something else or we don't solve something else because we don't talk to each other. How long it took between the climate process and the ozone process to get a proper discussion going, that the two issues were related. It took years. That's the reality. So I would say this is and this particular issue will come up in other areas too, as different parts of the world which are still having a lot of local air pollution, they'll clean up their cities, and there will be also less sulfur produced, and therefore there will be some heating, some global heating produced.
Not to interrupt, but I mean, joking aside, it's not clear to me that there wasn't some, you know, calculation made that. I think there was a recognition that this would have a modest negative impact on climate change, but it was, on balance, worth doing in order to get the air quality benefits. I think that calculation was made.
Okay,
that's my impression. But
not in any explicit or transparent way. There was one paper published by Baker Lee's group, but there was not. And when asked about it, the IMO said quite specifically, we just don't talk about that.
And in the meantime, we actually know that the impacts are going to be even more challenging than what the science said up to even 6 months ago. So we have an issue there, but so that's part of the answer. Then Olaf, so I agree with you. It is very challenging. That's the bottom line. I think what you said is that this will require the kind of international multilateral governance that is very difficult to see how it's going to happen. Because you could have the free driver problem of a country unilaterally going ahead, and depending on which country that is, that country could get away and doing it because sheer power and whatever else. So, but just because it's difficult, it doesn't mean one shouldn't try to address it, right? So, but I agree with you. It is very, very challenging, and but we have to deal with it. That's why we're talking about it.
Great. I think we've probably got time for one more question. Maybe the lady there in the red.
Hi, Leslie Hook from the FT. I'd like to ask each of our three panelists, what is your personal view of the tipping point at which you personally believe the world should do solar geoengineering? Is it 5 degrees in 2080 or 3 degrees in 2045? I know your institutions have rules about not endorsing, but just your personal perspective. Thank
you. Yes. It's not possible to answer that because we don't know enough, and we don't know how long it will take from the time you decide now we're ready for this. How long would it take to actually put this in place? We have some ideas. 15, 20 years of research, 25 years of discussion on the governance. You know, I don't know, but you know, if we are pretty sure now that in 25 years the temperature will be actually 3.5 degrees above historical average, then maybe there needs to be that discussion that now the decision has to be now and not in 25 years from now. So, and I don't have the answer personally, even just for myself, but I think these are the kind of questions we need to collectively look at and say, well, when does one trigger a serious discussion and a potential consideration, right? We don't know that because we haven't discussed it. And again, as I said earlier, different people from different circumstances and different backgrounds and different current climate impacts will think very differently about the way you weigh that risk. And that's the reality. So, sorry not to answer your question. But
Okay.
I don't think I'm going to answer it either, other than to say, I don't know when something might change, and you know, right now, I would say very, very few people on the planet, probably you could count them on one hand, would say we should be doing this now. I don't know when that might shift, but my personal view would be I would far rather be in a position of having done some of the background research so that we can either say, no, here's why not, or if you were to do it, here's how you should do it, here's what we think the impacts would be, here's what we think the uncertainties are. So that's sort of on the research side. I would say there's a case to be made to be doing the research now, and I'd say there's a similar case to be trying to develop the governance now so that we're not caught off guard at some point in the future.
When you ask the boiling frog, what time does the boiling point? Does the
Well, I would personally say that I don't know when the time is to start it, but I think I would agree with Janos that I would say that now is the time to start talking about it and to begin understanding it better, and intentionally that countries and individuals and actors intentionally begin to look at the issue and how it coordinates with all the other relevant parts of the puzzle, whether we sequence it, how we choreograph. But I think that there's a very strong argument for it being a part of our future, and that doesn't mean that I think it must, but that it looks like it very possibly could. So we need to really pull up the curtain and begin the conversation in a very open and informed way.
Tricky question. My final shot would be that if you really want a debate, you may have to put out a proposition on when you think this should happen that people can agree with or disagree with. But anyway, look, thank you very much. Great conversation. So everybody's invited to go to reception upstairs, which is in the room on your way out up the stairs. Thanks.